Liberal Viewer presents.
So, welcome to the November 10th edition of Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you like what I'm doing here. Also, there's a join button down there. You can become a member of my channel for the first time this week. And this week I picked out the weekend's 15 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. There's a link down in the video description to my clip list of my 15 clips if you won't want to follow along and try to read my cryptic notes. Impeachment is again the main topic I'm covering this week, as it looks again virtually certain that Trump will be impeached this year, including revelations this week and newly released transcripts and public hearings coming up just in time for the holidays, as Bill Maher pointed out in his monologue last Friday over in this clip.
Oh, if you have Trump-loving relatives for Thanksgiving this year, it's going to be fun. Because the impeachment hearings, where we actually see it, they start next week, just in time for the holidays. So, if you get asked, you know, what should I bring? Say Kevlar.
Kevlar. Now, if you want my opinion, what you should bring to your holiday family gatherings, your Thanksgiving dinner, it's an Impeach Trump t-shirt. Now, this white on black Impeach Trump t-shirt that I've been wearing, this is the last week I'll be wearing this shirt, because starting next week I will have my red on white Impeach Trump t-shirts. They're supposed to be printed out on November 15th, so down in the video description, there's a link where you can become one of my patrons on Patreon for $15 a month to get the shirt. It's a little more expensive if you join, if you click the join button on YouTube. That's because YouTube takes out about 3 times as much of a service fee as Patreon does. And then you can also just give me a direct $15 contribution on PayPal at a link I put down in the video description. In all cases, you have to give me a shipping address. You have to tell me if you want extra large, large or medium, and it's while supplies last. I only printed out 48 shirts, some of which have already been claimed, so there are about 40 left. Let me know if you want an Impeach Trump t-shirt that you can wear to your holiday Thanksgiving dinner that will hopefully start some good discussions. And actually, I thought Bill Maher had another pretty good joke about the impeachment testimony that came out this week, and I will play that second clip from Bill Maher's monologue. Of course, the entire monologue is available at a link down in the video description, but I will discuss this, 45-second clip with you after we watch it together over here.
What is so mind-boggling is that on the heels of the colluding with Russia that we just went through for 2 years, in 2016, they immediately turned around and called Ukraine to see if they could help with 2020. I mean, this impeachment thing keeps going. People just keep testifying every week that Trump demanded a quid pro quo from Ukraine, like they said from the beginning. I mean, we've heard from the Deputy Secretary of State, the envoy, the ambassador, the diplomat, the other diplomat, It's like a game of Clue, where every single person is saying, it was the fat guy in the Oval Office with the phone.
I like the Clue joke about how all the witnesses are testifying that it was the fat guy in the Oval Office using the phone to commit the crime. But what is the crime? And that's why the title of this week's video is Trump Asked for a Bribe. There is a federal statute against bribery, and it's not only against offering a public official a bribe, it's also a public official soliciting a bribe. In fact, this is I put a link down in the video description to 18 U.S. Code section 201, but here's the relevant section. It's 201 subsection C, subsection B, that whoever, being a public official, former public official, a person selected to be a public official otherwise than is provided by law for the proper discharge of an official duty directly or indirectly demands, receives, accepts, or receives or accept anything of value personally or because of any official act performed or to be performed. So basically, you cannot accept something of value in exchange for an official act, in this case, releasing the aid to the Ukraine. The something of value would be the investigation into the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory and the Burisma, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden supposed corruption. And that is the main topic of all the rest of the clips. Whether it's bribery, extortion, abuse of power, high crimes and misdemeanors. I happen to think bribery is the best label because if you look at your Constitution and you look at Section 4 of Article 2, this is my ACLU Constitution that I always carry around, and it says, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." So treason, bribery, and other crimes. So if they actually show a clear case of bribery, you can't have Republicans saying, well, that's not an impeachable offense, because bribery is obviously an impeachable offense. And this U.S. Code section didn't really exist back when the Constitution was written, but bribery is a common law crime that goes back to English common law, so it's basically a public official soliciting something of value. I talked weeks ago about how bribery and extortion are basically flip sides of the same crime, whether, bribery is the carrot, extortion is the stick. And anyway, I will talk about that a little more when we get to some newsmakers talking about that. But first, I want to show you 4 news summaries. First, as usual, the best and longest news summaries from NBC News' Meet the Press. Chuck Todd talks about first he gives a long introduction where he talks about how Trump is getting pressure on 2 fronts, both the impeachment front and then the election, off-year elections that looked really good for Democrats this week. And then he goes into the whole package that talks about all the evidence this week and even mentions Michael Bloomberg possibly getting into the Democratic race, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Sunday morning, President Trump finds himself facing pressure on 2 fronts. On impeachment, a growing number of witnesses testifying before Congress have now confirmed that military aid was being withheld until Ukraine agreed to publicly announce investigations into President Trump's rivals. There was more confirmation that, yes, the Ukrainians did know that a quid pro quo existed. And 3 witnesses who testified behind closed doors will now do so in public this week. Republicans, meanwhile, signaled yesterday that they hope to refocus the public hearings on Joe Biden's son and perhaps even on the whistleblower. Then there was Tuesday night's political fallout. President Trump made a special trip to Kentucky to support Republican Governor Matt Bevin, only to see Bevin lose a nail-biter to Democrat Andy Beshear. Democrats took control, though, of both houses of the Virginia legislature for the first time in a generation, and they also swept local elections from Missouri to Pennsylvania. The large takeaway? There's no ebbing the Democratic tide among suburban college-educated voters, the one-time foundation of Republican electoral success. Now, that should be a bright, flashing red light for both Republican office holders and for President Trump next year. But Democrats have their own flashing red light, as deep worries about the prospects of their top presidential candidates led Michael Bloomberg to take formal steps to enter the race. Still, on impeachment, there's no sign that Democrats are paying a political price, at least not yet.
Those open hearings will be an opportunity for the American people to evaluate the witnesses for themselves.
Democrats will begin to make their public case on impeachment to the country as a handful of current and former diplomats testify to a quid pro quo. The top U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, who opens hearings on Wednesday, that was my clear understanding. Security assistance money would not come until the president of Ukraine committed to pursue the investigation of the Bidens.
Ambassador Bill Taylor testified and gave the most sweeping and devastating testimony.
The National Security Council's top Ukraine expert, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, there was no doubt. Senior State Department official George Kent also told investigators that President Trump wanted nothing less than President Zelensky to go to a microphone and say investigations Biden and Clinton. And President Trump's former top Russia advisor, Fiona Hill, testified that U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, told Ukrainian officials in a July 10th meeting at the White House about how he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mulvaney for a meeting with the Ukrainians if they were going to go forward with investigations. And Sondland this week altered his testimony to acknowledge a quid pro quo as well, saying he told a Ukrainian official that resumption of the U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement. Congressional Republicans have struggled to defend the president, some acknowledging a quid pro quo, but insisting it is not impeachable.
There are perfectly appropriate quid pro quos, and there are inappropriate quid pro quos.
And now arguing if there was a quid pro quo, the president did not direct it.
Nobody has testified that there's a quid pro quo ordered by the President of the United States.
Instead, pointing the finger at Sondland. A month ago,
the text message that I saw from Ambassador Sondland, who's highly respected, was there's no quid pro quo.
But now,
let me just tell you, I hardly know the gentleman.
And Trump allies are reportedly eyeing others to blame, including White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani.
I don't know what Rudy did. I don't know what he's doing over there. If people want to look at Rudy, that's fine with me.
And joining me now from Bowling Green, Kentucky, is Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who sits on the Foreign Relations Committee.
And I will have a clip of Rand Paul's really hard to believe explanation of how Trump is not guilty of impeachable offenses, and Chuck Todd does not do a very good job of cross-examining him in that clip. If you're following along on your clip list, that Rand Paul clip is going to be clip number 9, but we are about to get to clip number 4, which is the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary, which actually is a close second to the Meet the Press news summary. In some ways, I think it's better. They give more context as to like where this all started and everything we've learned and where we are now. And this is one of the rare occasions where Martha Raddatz, or where the ABC This Week starts with a live introduction and then goes to a package, just like you saw with Meet the Press, where there's like a live introduction and then a pre-recorded video package. Martha Raddatz also narrating, and like I said, I think there's a little bit more more of a long-term context for the impeachment inquiry in this clip. Maybe, well, I don't know. You can let me know which one you think is better. I'll be uploading this as a premiere video, so live commenters will be able to comment along with me, lurking in the comment section, hopefully. I'll talk more about my technical difficulties when I get to the end here. But here is the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary. Martha Raddatz, permanent guest host, or whatever her title is. I think also explaining how we got where we are with a lot of good context over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. It started with one whistleblower. Now, less than 2 months later, a full-blown impeachment inquiry set to reach a critical phase, the first public testimony that will likely shape public perceptions of the investigation and the future of the Trump presidency. The central questions: was it an abuse of power for the president to ask a foreign leader to investigate a political rival here at home? Was he acting to further his own personal and political interests by withholding military aid from a key U.S. ally? With all of the rhetoric flying from both sides of the aisle and President Trump's own freewheeling defense, we wanted to hit the pause button and ask, how did we get here?
The actions taken to date by the president have seriously violated the Constitution.
September 24th, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi formally opens an impeachment inquiry after a bombshell whistleblower complaint raised concerns over Trump's July phone call with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
The conversation was perfect. My phone call was perfecto.
According to a White House memo detailing that call, Trump tells the Ukrainian president, "We do a lot for Ukraine." Zelensky later responds, "We are ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps, specifically buying American anti-tank missiles." Trump's response, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." He goes on to ask Zelensky to investigate a debunked theory about the 2016 election and then a second request, an investigation into his Democratic rival.
It goes to the core of whether the president abused his office to seek political help in his re-election campaign, and did so to the detriment of our nation's security.
House Democrats have issued at least 26 subpoenas, and at least 15 individuals have appeared before Congress. According to witness testimony, Trump's demand was pushed by his top advisors, including his acting chief of staff and his personal attorney, in phone calls and meetings for months. Among the key testimonies so far, Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, who told Congress he was told everything, including military aid and a White House meeting, was contingent on Ukraine's willingness to launch the investigation Trump requested. Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, who in a stunning about-face revised his testimony. Sondland now saying he told a top Ukrainian official Ukraine would likely not receive military aid unless Ukraine publicly agreed to investigate Trump's targets. And Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, a White House national security official who was on that July phone call. Vindman recalled one meeting in particular where senior Ukrainian officials were told they had to investigate the Bidens. Colonel Vindman also testified he was told the hold on military aid came from the White House Chief of Staff's office. In the face of mounting evidence, the president has been unrelenting in his defense.
Impeachment witch hunt. It's all a hoax.
Republicans largely closing ranks around the president as Democrats move forward.
Those open hearings will be an opportunity for the American people to evaluate the witnesses for themselves, to make their own determinations about the credibility of the witnesses, but also to learn firsthand about the facts of the president's misconduct.
And joining me now to break this down further is ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran. And Terry, I want to start with these.
And Terry Moran and Martha Raddatz actually had a fairly good discussion of the procedures for impeachment based on the U.S. Constitution, of course. And so you can just read the Constitution if you want, or if you want to listen to what Terry Moran and Martha Raddatz talked about, there's a link down in the video description to the full ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos program. But I want to give you two more news summaries, and then I'm going to show you a bunch of Republicans who, like Martha Raddatz said, are trying to defend the president, but their defenses are all over the place and not very good, as I will talk about when I get to those newsmaker clips. But before I get to that, I want to show you two more news summaries. The one from CNN State of the Union with Jake Tapper is the next one I'm going to show you, and it's crisper, it's shorter, it doesn't have the details that you saw in the last two, and which of those last two were better? I don't know, after watching them both again, I think maybe the ABC News one was better than the NBC News one, but they were both really good summaries of all the stuff that's coming out, and I think ABC kind of showed you what you're going to be hearing in the public hearings this week. They kind of summarized from the transcripts some of the things you're going to hear, and it's pretty devastating for the president, and that's why we're on the brink. That's the State of the Union this week from Jake Tapper, and the one thing I think that is really good about this shorter CNN State of the Union news summary is I think they really stress the Mick Mulvaney connection, that he's refused to testify this week, but he seems to, it's like Mick Mulvaney and Rudy Giuliani are the, Trump didn't tell any of these people directly to do the quid pro quo. He used Mulvaney and Giuliani, and I think that is made fairly clear in the CNN State of the Union news summary from Jake Tapper at the beginning of the program this morning. Over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is on the brink. Today is the beginning of what could be a pivotal week in the impeachment inquiry, when Americans will get to hear for the first time directly from 3 witnesses at the center of the investigation. The public hearings are set to begin after the release of transcripts showing 2 key witnesses, National Security Council staffers Dr. Fiona Hill, who has since left the White House, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, testified that they were told that the push to get Ukraine to open investigations into the Bidens and the 2016 election was coordinated by acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. On Friday, Mulvaney defied a congressional subpoena, refusing to testify, instead asking to join a lawsuit that will settle whether certain current and former White House officials can be forced to testify. This could set up a potential constitutional crisis, as the White House exerts executive privilege over some of the witnesses Congress believes, Democrats in Congress believe, are the most crucial to its investigation. Republicans are also giving some new clues into their strategy. They've released a list of witnesses that they want called to publicly testify as part of the inquiry, including Hunter Biden and the whistleblower. In a letter released late Saturday, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff said that the whistleblower will not be called, saying that testimony is, quote, redundant and unnecessary. Joining me now to discuss all of this, a Republican senator who has been directly involved in U.S.-Ukraine policy, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin.
And I'm going to have a couple clips. The last 2 clips are Jake Tapper doing his best to get a straight answer out of Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. And he didn't keep saying Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. That's like Chuck Todd's thing. He loves to say Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. I don't know why, but he did say it that one time there. And but like I said, I thought that was another good news summary. And then the last news summary I'm going to show is the Fox News Sunday news summary, which was actually pretty journalistic, pretty much straight news. There's this reporter I haven't seen before, Ellison Barber. The one where there are a couple little criticisms I have. First, they had to show how Trump got cheered at the Alabama LSU game, I guess it was, and apparently it's the game of the century. I don't know. They never really explained that. That's like a weird thing in here. And while this news summary is fairly journalistic, Chris Wallace, in his questioning of newsmakers, took this really weird Trump spin on things and really concentrated on the witnesses the Republicans want to call. Like, they want to call the whistleblower, they want to call Hunter Biden. And later it'll be Nellie Orr will come up in the questioning of the newsmakers in the clips I'm going to show later. But you'll see that even in this fairly good journalistic news summary from Ellison Barber, they do end with pictures of Hunter Biden and this mystery shadow picture of the unknown whistleblower, which is I don't know why they concentrate on that so much on Fox News Sunday, but I will talk about that news summary a little more, the final news summary, before we get to the newsmakers that I will talk about with you after we watch them together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The House Democratic effort to impeach President Trump moves into a key new phase this week: public hearings, in which career government officials will testify on camera about how President Trump pressured Ukraine to investigate his political rivals. The big question: will this change the dynamic of an inquiry that so far has remained strictly partisan? In a moment, we'll speak with 2 members of the House Intelligence Committee that will hold the made-for-TV hearings, Republican Will Hurd and Democrat Sean Patrick Maloney. But first, let's bring in Ellison Barber, who has the latest from the White House. Ellison.
Chris, one of the first witnesses we expect to hear from this week is the career diplomat who testified behind closed doors. It was his understanding that everything, military aid and an Oval Office visit, was contingent on Ukraine investigating the Bidens and 2016. The 45th president cheered at the game of the century, hours before the start of a week that could turn his political future upside down. 3 public hearings are set to take place on 2 different days. On Wednesday, the House Intelligence Committee will hear from the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine and a top State Department official. On Friday, the former ambassador to Ukraine. House Democrats released their closed-door testimonies this week. William Taylor's, arguably the most explosive. The career diplomat testified it was his clear understanding security assistance money would not come until the president of Ukraine committed to pursue the investigations President Trump wanted. President Trump continues to call the inquiry.
The witch hunt continues.
But claims his party is on the same page.
The Republicans have never been so united.
Congressional Republicans want to hear from at least 14 witnesses, including former Vice President Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and the whistleblower whose complaint helped initiate the impeachment inquiry. Chairman Adam Schiff responding with a warning. The committee will not serve as vehicles to carry out sham investigations into the Bidens or debunked conspiracies about 2016.
Rules approved by the House essentially give Democrats veto power here. Witnesses must be approved by the chairman of the Intelligence Committee or the full committee. Chris.
Ellison Barber reporting from the White House. Ellison, thank you.
So, like I said, that news summary wasn't so bad for Fox News. I mean, Fox News Sunday is one of the more straight news oases on Fox News, especially now that Shepard Smith is gone and Catherine Herridge apparently is leaving because she says facts are facts, and Chris Wallace maybe, I criticize him a lot because he certainly isn't a totally unbiased journalist. He does definitely carry water for Trump and the Republicans, and Fox News Sunday is definitely biased towards the Trump perspective, and I'll show that when I get to the Fox News clips. If you're following along on your clip list, that's clips number 11 and 12 of my 15 clips, but I actually want to get to the first newsmaker, and this is Jackie Speier, Democrat from California, who I think does the best job of making the point I was making before about bribery. Remember 18 USC section 201 sub C sub B sub C sub 1 sub B that talks about it being the crime of bribery for a public official to solicit anything of value in exchange for an official act. Like releasing the aid to the Ukraine and asking for an investigation into the 2016 CrowdStrike conspiracy theory and Hunter Biden. As you saw, Ellison Barber in her news summary show a big picture of Hunter Biden there. And so this is Jackie Speier pointing out that this is the crime of bribery. This is the clearest enunciation of that crime on the Sunday morning news analysis shows, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch Martha Raddatz. And it's interesting, Martha Raddatz's question is about how Robert Mueller's testimony was not all that electrifying, not all that impactful after the whole Mueller report, and Jackie Speier explains why this impeachment is going to be different than the whole Mueller fiasco. I mean, I thought that Trump deserved to be impeached based on the obstruction of justice charges in the Mueller report, but it's a 448-page report that not many people read, and this is a lot more clear, especially if you understand what bribery is. Soliciting a bribe is bribery under 18 USC 201, and bribery is specifically mentioned as an impeachable offense, and that's what Jackie Speier told Martha Raddatz on ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning over in this
committee, which will conduct those public hearings this week. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me ask you, Robert Mueller's public testimony earlier this year did not galvanize public opinion on the findings of his investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. And while this is obviously a different allegation, how do you make a stronger public case this time?
I think for a number of reasons. First of all, Bob Mueller's report was 400 pages long, had a lot of legalese. This is a very simple, straightforward act. The president broke the law. He went on a telephone call with the president of Ukraine and said, I have a favor, though, and then proceeded to ask for an investigation of his rival. And this is a very strong case of bribery because you have an elected official, the president, demanding action of a foreign country in this case, and providing something of value, which is the investigation, and he is withholding aid, which is that official act. And the Constitution's very clear: treason, bribery, or acts of omission. And in this case, it is clearly one of those.
Obviously, Republicans would disagree with you on a lot of that. Republicans sent their list of witnesses that they want to call as part of the entire.
And, you know, you see there Martha Raddatz then did ask Jackie Speier about the Republican witnesses, which seems to be the focus of the Fox News Sunday interviews that I'll get to in a little bit. So it's not like no one should ever ask that question. It just shouldn't be the main focus like they're doing on Fox News, which I'll talk about again a little bit later. But I want to show one more ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos clip. This is Martha Raddatz talking to the other side. This is Mac Thornberry, and I think his defense of Trump is all over the place and not really coherent. If you follow along, you see that Martha Raddatz does a good job of pointing out that he's talking about process when she's asking about substance, and eventually you'll see that he says that what Trump did was inappropriate but not impeachable, although the whole bribery thing doesn't really come up. And that's my one criticism of Martha Raddatz, is she doesn't bring up the whole bribery issue, since bribery is specifically listed as an impeachable offense. But I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch this second interview clip from Martha Raddatz talking to a Republican, Mac Thornberry, for a little over 3 minutes over here.
Committee. And Congressman Thornberry, you just heard Congresswoman Speier lay out the Democratic strategy for these public hearings. Republicans have criticized the process of this inquiry up to now. What's the Republican strategy to combat the substance of these allegations?
Well, you started out, Martha, by saying, how did we get here? And let me add a couple of things to that, because I think it is important to remember. Shortly after President Trump was inaugurated, there were Democrats who were calling for him to be impeached because they were so surprised at the results of the last election. We literally had 2.5 years of investigations, subpoenas, the Mueller report, all of that. And then all of a sudden in September, the whistleblower comes forward and says, oh, but there's this conversation that I worried about. All of that 2.5 years of investigation gets swept aside, and now the Democrats put all of their eggs in this one basket. The problem is they started this basket not with the Nixon and Clinton precedents as far as making sure there was appropriate transparency and due process. They have made it one-sided from the beginning, very partisan. So I think whatever happens now, there will be a taint to this one-sided partisan approach to impeachment that is different than has been used before. And so I think there will be intense skepticism about whatever they come up with. Again, they don't
Congressman,
let lawyer there. They don't let the witnesses come. It has been one-sided from the beginning.
Congressman, you're again talking about the process. I ask you about substance. How do you fend against this substance?
Well, as you know, maybe you know, Martha, I believe that it is inappropriate for a president to ask a foreign leader to investigate a political rival. Now, it leads to a question. If there's a political rival with a family member who's involved in questionable activity, what do? Just let them alone. But set that aside. I believe it was inappropriate. I do not believe it was impeachable. And process, y'all always want to say substance, not process. There's a reason we let murderers and robbers and rapists go free when their due process rights have been violated. We believe the integrity of the system, the integrity of the Constitution, the integrity of the processes under our legal system is more important than the outcome of one particular case. So I don't think you can sweep process under the rug because it is part of an impeachment decision which has a constitutional requirement, bribery, treason, high crimes and misdemeanors, but also a political element about whether it's good for the country to pursue it under these circumstances.
Why is what you have seen not a clear abuse of power? I know you've said it's inappropriate.
And you see there, Martha Raddatz goes to abuse of power. It doesn't mention bribery. And I don't know if there was like a weird Freudian slip there where Mac Thornberry said bribery, treason, and high crimes and misdemeanors. At least he did better than Jackie Spear, who couldn't remember the high crimes and misdemeanors and said something like omissions or something in the previous clip. So I wish Martha Raddatz had mentioned bribery, but I don't know, the Mac Thornberry defense there just didn't seem all that cogent or applicable or relevant to the facts that we're learning and the facts I think that we're going to learn in public hearings this week. And now I want to show the two NBC News Meet the Press clips on this. Rand Paul and then Jim Himes, a Republican and a Democrat, just like I showed from ABC. And like I said earlier, Chuck Todd does a really bad job of cross-examining Rand Paul here, lets him get away with saying that, oh, you know, what Trump did is just like what Joe Biden did, even though Joe Biden was, there are good and bad quid pro quos. I've been saying this for weeks. I've been making the point that not all quid pro quos are bad and not all bad things require a quid pro quo. Like, basically, almost all foreign policy objectives involve quid pro quos. All our treaties, like our nuclear disarmament treaties, say, we will cut our nuclear arms by half if you cut your nuclear arms by half. That's a quid pro quo. That's foreign policy. That's a non-corrupt quid pro quo. But if the quid pro quo is I will release the foreign aid to the Ukraine that Congress authorized, and I'm holding up through this impoundment power that I'm using with no good rationale. So I will release the aid to the Ukraine if you investigate my political rival. That's a corrupt quid pro quo. And I think Rand Paul just doesn't get that. And it's very different from the quid pro quo when Biden asked the Ukraine to fire a corrupt prosecutor in line with the foreign policy of the United States and all the EU nations, and Chuck Todd doesn't really follow up on that. Later I'll show Jim Himes in the next clip does at least contradict it on the Meet the Press program, so it doesn't go uncontradicted, but Chuck Todd does not do a good job of cross-examining Rand Paul and his weird theory of why Trump does not deserve to be impeached, despite my Impeach Trump t-shirt that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Events that were going to be taking place this week. First, let me just simply ask, have you been reading the transcripts that they've been released?
You know, I've been reading the reports of them, the actual transcripts. I haven't seen it, but I guess my impression so far is I think the American people want fairness, and I don't think they're going to judge fairness when they're accusing President Trump of the same thing Joe Biden did, threatening the aid if some kind of corruption's not investigated. And it seems like everybody, both parties, have been threatening aid if some kind of investigation either doesn't happen or is ended. And so I think really what's going to happen is people are going to say, oh, they're impeaching President Trump for exactly the same thing that Joe Biden did. He threatened the aid if they didn't fire someone, and supposedly the president did if they didn't investigate someone. So it sounds exactly like what Joe Biden did, and if they weren't going to impeach Joe Biden, they look like, you know, hypocrites in a way for going only after President Trump but having not a word to say about what Joe Biden did.
So you think it's perfectly appropriate for the president of the United States to have sought this quid pro quo from Ukraine's government? Let's say I want to set aside. I want to set aside what Vice President Biden. I just want you to know: is it appropriate for the president of the United States to have engaged in this?
I think there's a real question whether you think the president should specifically go after one person, but there's a real question whether Joe Biden should have gone after one prosecutor. It's exactly the same scenario.
No,
so I think there is a question.
States.
Well, let me finish. There is a question about that, but if it were me, I wouldn't give them the aid because we don't have the money. We have to actually borrow the money from China to send it to Ukraine. So I'm against the aid, and I think it's a mistake to do the aid, so I wouldn't have played any of these games. But I think the American people think it's unfair to treat Trump under one standard and Joe Biden under a different standard.
But is that really being, I understand trying to go back. I go back to, do two wrongs make a right? I want to set that aside because I don't understand why that's always used as a deflection. Does that mean you think it's now okay for the president to act this way? It doesn't matter what we think of Joe Biden at this point. If it's wrong for this to be done, then it's wrong, period. No?
Well, it kind of does. It kind of does, but I'll approach it from a different way. Fairness is one angle, and I don't think people are going to think this is fair. But I think the second angle is this. Foreign aid, by law, can only go out to countries that are not corrupt. So if you think that a country is acting in a corrupt way, president can always withhold aid until the corruption is fixed. So you're going to have to get in the mind of Trump and his advisors and say, well, he didn't really believe that the Bidens were corrupt. I think he absolutely does. I think you give him a lie detector test and say, do you think the Bidens were corrupt? And do you think you were investigating corruption and that corruption is in the law, that you can't give aid to a country that has corruption? So there's no way. This ends up being a policy debate and a partisan debate and has nothing to do with legality or illegality or impeachment. It's purely a partisan way of trying to overturn the election.
Do you believe there should be a distinction between whether people in the administration ask for a quid pro quo and whether the president himself directed it? Do you think there's a distinction there? If there's no proof the president himself directed it, but for instance, as we've seen these transcripts indicate about perhaps Mick Mulvaney was directing this, does that distinction matter to you?
I think we've gotten lost in this whole idea of quid pro quo, and I think Senator Kennedy kind of hit the nail on the head, is that if you're not allowed to give aid to people who are corrupt, there's always contingencies on aid. Even President Obama withheld aid. You know, he was supposed to give lethal aid. Congress said give them $300 million in lethal aid, and he sent them blankets. So presidents since the beginning of time have resisted Congress, and there's been this sort of back and forth jockeying over what is sent. But also presidents have withheld aid before for corruption. So the thing is I think it's a mistake to say, oh, he withheld aid until he got what he wanted. Well, if it's corruption and he believes there to be corruption, he has every right to withhold aid. So I think it's a big mistake for anybody to argue quid pro quo. It didn't have quid pro quo, and I know that's what the administration's arguing. I wouldn't make that argument. I would make the argument that every politician in Washington, other than me virtually, is trying to manipulate Ukraine to their purposes. Menendez tried it, Murphy tried it, Biden tried it, Trump's tried it. They're all doing it. They are all trying to manipulate Ukraine to get some kind of investigation, either end an investigation or start an investigation.
Let me ask the question this way, though. If you're the average American citizen watching this, should you be concerned that the President of the United States wanted a foreign government to help investigate a political rival? Do you understand why some people think that that is basically abusing the office for political gain to mess with the election?
I think you're right, Chuck, but I think an equal number of people are upset that Hillary Clinton hired a British spy to hire Russians to get dirt called the Steele dossier. So here's Hillary Clinton in the middle of a campaign hiring a foreign spy agency or a foreign spy.
Right, you did it again to me.
British spy agency.
You did it again. You went back and said, okay, there's behavior that's bad over here, there's behavior that's bad over there. All that does is condition us for more bad behavior. When do we put a stop to it?
No, but what it says is, no, what I'm asking for is that they be treated equally. And I think the American public's going to say, if you didn't do anything to Hillary Clinton for hiring a foreign spy, why is it all of a sudden wrong for President Trump to try to have a country investigate someone? Well, what I would say is that people want them to be treated fairly. I'm not saying 2 wrongs make a right. I'm not even saying I would have done it that way. All I'm saying is that you're going to impeach President Trump and you're going to give Hillary Clinton, let her skate. So then I think people see that as unfair, and so it becomes partisan. That's why no Republicans voted for impeachment.
Is there anything that you could hear that might make you... Are you...
The Steele dossier? The Steele dossier? I can't believe... I mean, he let him claim that what Biden did was exactly like what Trump is doing without any real cross-examination. Bad job by Chuck Todd. And then even let him bring up the Steele dossier, where Hillary Clinton, not a government official, paid a foreigner to find out how Trump was involved in Russia, or to find even gossip about how Trump was involved with Russia. But if you pay for something from a British, a foreigner, a foreign national, for your campaign, that's not a campaign finance violation. It's only if you get something of value without paying for it that's a campaign finance violation. And it's certainly not a public official getting bribed or soliciting a bribe like I was talking about with 18 U.S.C. Section 201, the bribe is soliciting a bribe statute that makes it a per se impeachable offense. So Chuck Todd didn't do a great job of cross-examining Rand Paul and his weird defense of Trump there, although Jim Himes, in a later clip that I'm about to show you, did some of the job that Chuck Todd didn't do. Although you'll see here, he doesn't talk about bribery. He talks about 18 U.S.C. 872 extortion, where bribery and extortion are basically the same crime. Bribery is the carrot side, and extortion is the stick side, because it's not asking for something in order to do an official act. It's threatening something, or I won't do the official act. So it's basically the same crime, carrot versus stick, and that's Jim Himes' position. I don't think it's as good as bribery, just because bribery is specifically mentioned in the Constitution as an impeachable offense. But in addition to that criticism, I have to give kudos to Jim Himes for doing the cross-examination of Rand Paul's fairly ridiculous rant defending Trump that Chuck Todd didn't do over in this clip.
Good morning, Chuck.
Let me start with this. Will there be new information the public learns from these public hearings on Wednesday morning?
There will be new information. I suspect most of the public has not read the released transcripts, and what they're going to hear is they are going to hear immensely patriotic, beautifully articulated, articulate people telling the story of a president who, let's forget quid pro quo. Quid pro quo is one of these things to muddy the works, who extorted a vulnerable country by holding up military aid. So yes, they are going to hear something new. And Chuck, if you'll grant me 1 second here, my head is only now decombusting from the exchange you had with Rand Paul. I've spent 11 years in public service defending the press, and when Senator Rand Paul comes on and says that what Donald Trump did, and the transcript is there, extorting a foreign government for his personal political gain, and that's exactly the same thing as Joe Biden, exactly the same thing as what he said, as Joe Biden saying that this prosecutor should be released, when Joe Biden is acting in consistency with American foreign policy, and back then we had a whole list of things that had to be done, and this was American foreign policy, it was European Union policy, it was IMF policy, that this prosecutor needed to go. When Rand Paul says that that's exactly the same thing as the President of the United States saying you need to find dirt on my political opponent, and with all due respect, Chuck, when you say, well, do 2 wrongs make a right, let's be very clear. The President of the United States demanding, extorting a vulnerable country to do his political bidding, to go after his opponent, has nothing to do with Joe Biden executing the foreign policy of the United States or Hillary Clinton, who is a private citizen, doing opposition research on her presidential opponent. Those are radically different things, and what the president did is wrong and impeachable.
Let me ask you something. You just said you think the words quid pro.
So, yeah, like I said, I pretty much criticized that clip. I thought that Jim Himes did a pretty good job of doing the cross-examination of Rand Paul that Chuck Todd didn't do, but he did use extortion rather than bribery, and I think bribery is the better term, the better messaging for Democrats for reasons I explained before I showed that clip. And now I wanted to move on to a couple Fox News Sunday clips. You know, I was mentioned when I showed the Fox News Sunday news summary that it was pretty journalistic. It was fairly straight news, you know, other than the focus on the on Hunter Biden as a possible witness for the impeachment hearings and the shadowy whistleblower figure, and that actually was the main focus of Chris Wallace in his Newsmaker interviews, both with Republican Will Hurd and then with Democrat Sean Mahoney. And I'm not going to show all the questions that Chris Wallace asked Will Hurd about the witness list and the whistleblower and the getting Hunter Biden to testify, and Will Hurd said a bunch of positive things in terms of, you know, the Trump universe on those issues. But then finally at the end, Chris Wallace brought out what might make Will Hurd vote for impeachment and some of the evidence of impeachable offenses and the quid pro quo evidence. Finally, like I said, so this is the one good part of Chris Wallace's interview with Will Hurd after starting off with a bunch of bogus Republican talking points that I think showed he was not much of a straight news anchor. But anyway, this is the good part of Chris Wallace's interview with Will Hurd over here.
Specifically, though, about this, because there seemed to be two issues that were part of the quid pro quo. One was military aid. One was a meeting that the Ukrainians very much wanted between their President Zelensky and President Trump. All three of the witnesses that are going to testify this week, you see them up there, William Taylor, George Kent, Marie Yovanovitch, all career Foreign Service officers, say there was a clear connection between support for Ukraine, of various forms, U.S. support for Ukraine, and Ukraine investigating the Democrats. If you are satisfied that that is true, that there was this connection, this nexus, is that an impeachable offense?
Well, I don't know if it was necessarily investigate the Democrats, right? I think it was investigation of corruption. And so people have made assumptions.
Forgive me, sir, but specifically what President Trump said on that July 25th phone call was investigate the Democratic role in the 2016 election, whether they were involved in hacking the DNC server, and also specifically the Bidens and Burisma.
Well, on the 2016 elections, now some of that information was based on what has been kind of fringe thinking, but back when even Democrats started investigating the Russian involvement in our 2016 elections, there was a Ukraine nexus. And so trying to get to the bottom of that, is that a violation of the law? Now, was that an understanding based on debunk information? Yes, but is it a violation of the law? I don't think so.
But specifically, sir, the question is, if there was a quid pro quo, U.S. aid for Ukraine was going to depend on their doing these investigations of political rivals of the president, is that an impeachable offense?
I think if you're trying to get information on a political rival to use in a political campaign is not something a president or any official should be doing. I think most Republicans have said that would be a violation of the law.
So that, in your view, if that were established to your satisfaction, I repeat, that would be an impeachable offense.
I believe that's something that would make it, have to truly consider whether impeachment is the right tool or not.
And we will see what happens this week and whether or not it persuades you. Congressman Hurd, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Good to talk with you.
Now, Will Hurd is one of the most moderate of all the Republicans, one of the most reasonable of all the Republicans, and he said he still, even if it turns out that what we know is true, that he doesn't know for sure if impeachment is the right tool for a president who held up aid to the Ukraine in exchange for investigating his political rivals. So, but at least Chris Wallace, at the end of his interview with Will Hurd, did get to that issue. But there was an incredible focus on the Republican talking points and the whole alternative universe view of this, that it's, that Trump is being, you heard there, that Trump was understandably felt under siege or whatever, and Will Hurd did make those talking points, but you can see what I mean about Chris Wallace's role in all of this, and Fox News Sunday not being completely journalistic in the way he cross-examined Sean Maloney, the Democrat, all about the process and about, more focus on Hunter Biden and the whistleblower and Nellie Orr, of all people, in this final Fox News Sunday clip I will talk about with you after we watch it together. And at least Chris Wallace does have a introduction here where he shows a little bit of Republican hypocrisy before he focuses on the Republican talking points, and the rest of the clip I'll talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
House Republicans have complained for weeks about Democrats interviewing key witnesses in the impeachment probe behind closed doors. Well, now that public hearings are about to start, the GOP is still complaining. Let's bring in Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney of New York, a Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. Congressman, as I discussed with Congressman Hurd, Republicans have now put out their written list of witnesses. It includes Hunter Biden, the unnamed whistleblower, and Nellie Orr, who folks may remember, she worked for Fusion GPS, which sought information from sources in Ukraine in 2016 and put up the Steele dossier. Will Democrats agree to call any of these witnesses? And if you don't, what does that say about the fairness of this entire proceeding?
Well, I can't speak for the chairman, but what I can tell you is that I think we will end up calling some of the witnesses on that list. And here's my test. My test is, do these witnesses have important information, knowledge, or evidence about the president's conduct? And if it passes that test, then we should call them, sure.
So let's ask specifically Hunter Biden, Nellie Orr, the unnamed whistleblower. Do any of them pass that test and therefore should be called?
The first two, no. The third one, you just heard Congressman Hurd give a very eloquent explanation of why we don't force the revelation of a whistleblower's identity. So no in all three cases, but for different reasons.
Well, I mean, let's focus on Hunter Biden.
Let's not focus on Hunter Biden. And I mean, the whole Hunter Biden thing is irrelevant as, and that's something that Sean Maloney says later, that, what does he have to say about on his standard? What does he have to say about how Trump committed, or he doesn't say bribery, but committed impeachable offenses, how he held up the aid to the Ukraine to ask for these investigations. And I think that Sean Maloney did enunciate that standard in a way that is defensible and rational, and you can see how that's an example of the way Fox News Sunday and Fox News in general, and even Chris Wallace, the supposedly straight news journalist, is focusing in on the Republican talking points about the conspiracy, and not the quid pro quo, the bribery, the campaign finance violation, all of that. But I want to show John Kennedy now on CBS News' Face the Nation. This is the only CBS News Face the Nation clip because Margaret Brennan didn't do a news summary this week, so there was no Face the Nation news summary. I think that she does a good job. Well, she doesn't cross-examine John Kennedy, the Republican senator from Louisiana, very well during his long exposition of why Trump's not guilty in a way. Well, he seems almost, if you listen carefully, like he could vote to remove Trump from office if the evidence shows what I think the evidence actually is going to show, that he had a corrupt intent to investigate his political rival. He uses some weird metaphors, colorful language. There's this weird thing well, I can't answer that hypothetical. He doesn't say that, but it's like asking me how many fish would I have caught if I didn't fish last Saturday, or whatever it was he says in here. And and of course the media is lapping things up like puppies. There's all sorts of colorful language, but if you listen carefully, it sounds like even this most right-wing Republican from Louisiana may be willing to vote to remove Trump from office based on the evidence that we are probably going to hear about his corrupt intent. Because he says if he just wanted to investigate corruption in Ukraine, which is really, really hard to believe, that would be okay. But if he wanted to investigate he wanted to get Ukraine to investigate his political rival, that might be an impeachable offense. And so that's something we learned from John Kennedy of Louisiana talking to Margaret Brennan in the one CBS News Face the Nation clip for the show tonight over here.
What is so mind-boggling?
Made to the American public in these public hearings. So is there anything that you could hear from Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, if and when he's called to testify, that would lead you to ever vote for the removal of the president?
Well, again, I've got to hear the testimony.
So that means maybe.
If you want to, if you would try to assess how a trial is going for a defendant, you don't just listen to the lawyer's opening statements, and you don't just read the transcript. You sit there and listen to all the testimony, the cross-examination, and the context. Mm-hmm. And I think that Speaker Pelosi's decision and Adam Schiff's decision to prevent the Republicans from calling their own witnesses in the live testimony is just doubling down on stupid. The American people, I think, are going to look at this and go, I get it. They're going to give the president a fair and impartial firing squad.
So and
that's not due process.
But you're not suggesting here that the witnesses, like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, lack credibility?
I don't know. I wasn't allowed to hear them. What I am telling you is that if it can be demonstrated that the president asked for and had the requisite state of mind, that the president asked for an investigation of a political rival, that's over the line.
Okay.
But if he asked for an investigation of possible corruption by someone who happens to be a political rival, that's not over the line.
So over the line, does that mean impeachable?
Yeah, probably.
So there is something you could hear that
you're
could potentially persuade you to vote for removal?
Well, I can't answer that, Margaret, because that encompasses all possible scenarios. That's like asking me if I didn't go fishing Saturday, how many fish would I have caught? All I'm saying is that it ought to be fair. It ought to be public. I read somewhere that democracy dies in darkness. It ought to be public. Both sides ought to be able to call their witnesses in front of God and country and the American people. Mm-hmm. and then let the American people decide. And the president and his counsel should be allowed to participate. Now, I think that would be fair, and then I will happily judge the evidence. But you can't limit the witnesses, as Chairman Schiff and Speaker Pelosi are doing, selectively leak portions of the transcript that favor your opinion to friendly members of the press who lap it up like a puppy. I don't think any fair-minded person in the Milky Way believes that Speaker Pelosi or Chairman Schiff are impartial here.
Well, we look forward to the trial.
We
look forward to the trial in the Senate and then seeing what you decide to do. Senator, thank you for joining us. And the question is, of course, with our next guest, the assumption, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell joins us now, is that when...
And I don't have any of the Eric Swalwell clips, like that's the only CBS News Face the Nation clip. But did you hear at the end there, Margaret Brennan said, well, we look forward to the trial in the Senate, which she's assuming that Trump is going to be impeached in the House, which I, of course, think is almost, it's like 99% likely at this point, so I can't really fault her for making that assumption, but journalistically, it seems almost like her frustration for saying, you heard John Kennedy, the Republican, saying how Trump is not getting all these due process rights that you're supposed to get in a trial. When the trial takes place in the Senate, the impeachment is really just an accusation from the House. It's kind of like a grand jury indictment. But anyway, I want to get to my last two clips. This is from CNN State of the Union. Jake Tapper also doing his best to deal with this idea that, Trump just was really worried about corruption in the Ukraine, even though there are all these corrupt dictators who he cozies up to all over the world, including Erdogan, who's coming apparently next week to visit the White House. But anyway, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin seems to think, even though, first he's believing Trump, no quid pro quo. He was very adamant. He strenuously denied the whole quid pro quo thing, even though all these witnesses are saying that it was what he meant. Well, that's the first clip, is about the whole corruption defense. You also heard from previous Republicans. Here's here's Jake Tapper. That was my bribery image, but no, here's Jake Tapper trying to cross-examine Ron Johnson of Wisconsin in part one of two parts of cross-examination over here.
So if we can first, I'd like to try to just get some information, because you had a window into a lot of this and that the rest of us don't have. On August 31st, you called President Trump to ask him point blank whether military aid to Ukraine was being held up in exchange for Ukraine publicly announcing these political investigations. And you say that the president strongly denied it. But one day later, on September 1st, Ambassador Sondland, as he testified to Congress, quote, spoke individually with Mr. Yermak, the Ukrainian advisor to the president of Ukraine, where I said, this is Sondland speaking, that the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for weeks, unquote. And just to be clear, what that means by the anti-corruption effort, Sondland had said this was part of a, quote, effort to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign, unquote. So how do you reconcile that the Ukrainians were being told they needed to announce these investigations publicly if they wanted that aid, one day after President Trump told you strongly that that was not the case?
Well, first of all, let me correct your typification of why I called the president. I called the president to try and to convince him to let me let President Zelensky know I was going to make a trip to Ukraine the following week. I met with President Zelensky with Senator Murphy on September 5th. And my main point was I was trying to get him to give me the clearance to tell President Zelensky that the aid was going to be provided. And so when I asked him that, he was, again, very consistent. He said, Ron, you know what a corrupt place it is. And besides, Ron, why isn't Europe stepping up the plate? I talked to Angela Merkel. And I say, why don't you provide funding for these things? And Angela Merkel tells me, because you will. Ron, we're schmucks. And so that was the rationale that he'd consistently been providing to certainly me and I think other people in his administration of why he had serious reservations, and I would say legitimate reservations, about providing, hard-earned taxpayer dollars to Ukraine.
So can I just interject for 1 second? I
want up to President Trump. Listen.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead. I just want to. It's not true that Europe. It's not true that Europe doesn't help the Ukrainians. I mean, I just want to. This is not you saying it's President Trump.
I'm not here to argue. I'm just.
I just want to argue with you. I just want our viewers to know. I'm here
to provide.
Yeah. I just want to correct the one thing that President Trump said, because the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development says that the EU contributed $425.2 million on average for 2016-2017. The U.S. was second with $204 million. Again, I'm not fact-checking you. The president's impression is incorrect. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Jake, I'm not here to argue the individual points. I'm trying to give you what exactly happened. Okay,
please.
So your listeners hear different viewpoint, different perspectives. So I'm the one that raised the issue from my phone call with Gordon Sondland the day before, where he described some type of something that Ukraine had to do before President Trump would release the funding. And when I brought up that scenario, President Trump immediately, and I've described as adamantly and vehemently denied it. So that's really what the purpose of that phone call was. But going back to the May 23rd meeting in the Oval Office, and this is what Kurt Volker testified, that President Trump basically said, I can't, I don't have the, my impression of what the exact quote was, but this is largely true. Kurt Volker said, this is what President Trump said about Ukraine. They are all corrupt. I don't want to spend any time with that. That was his general feeling of Ukraine. One of the things I was trying to do, we were all trying to do, is get him to meet with President Zelensky. We felt he would be every bit as impressed with President Zelensky's dedication to fulfilling his mandate to not only fight corruption, but as he said in a speech in Ukraine that Murphy and I attended, to defeat corruption. We were very confident that President Trump would meet President Zelensky. He would kind of feel a soulmate there, and the support would flow. And also, Jake, I have to point out, I found out about the withholding of the holdup in the funding about the end of August, August 28th, 29th.
Right.
The funding was released by September 11th, largely due to a lot of pressure put on by people like me and Senator Portman and Senator Durbin and other people. So
also the whistleblower
again,
complaint.
The funding was released, and go ahead.
Well, the whistleblower complaint came out, and then 2 days later, the aid was released. Who knows
exactly why? But a lot of us were trying to put that pressure on.
Fair enough.
But again, I remain sympathetic with President Trump's legitimate concerns about the corruption. When you're going to provide hundreds of millions of dollars of hard-earned American taxpayer dollars into a system, you want to make sure it's not corrupt. I think he's been very consistent in his conversations with me and others that was his reason for withholding the funding.
Yeah.
I like the part there where Jake Tapper says, well, because of the whistleblower complaint, that's why the aid was released. And the whole corruption, Trump was trying to investigate corruption defense that you saw Ron Johnson of Wisconsin there try to make. In this next clip, I think Jake Tapper really dismantles that entire defense, both pointing out how various people are going to testify this week that corruption was really just a code word for investigating the Bidens, that the whole CrowdStrike thing was a conspiracy theory, even showing Tom Bossert, Trump's Homeland Security advisor, on ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos, in a clip I showed a couple months back, saying that the whole CrowdStrike thing was a conspiracy theory. And I think Jake Tapper shows how lacking in substance the defense of Trump is in the final news clip I'm going to show you. Before I do have a bonus, Sandy's lying down snoring right there, and Dash has been walking back and forth this whole time, and I actually captured a Dash and Sandy clip from right over there. I'll show you after this final news clip of Jake Tapper really dismantling the Ron Johnson of Wisconsin defense of Donald Trump in the final news clip that we can watch together over here.
Hard-earned American taxpayer dollars into a system, you want to make sure it's not corrupt. I think he's been very consistent in his conversations with me and others that was his reason for withholding the funding.
Yeah, so I think the thing is, when he spoke with President Zelensky on July 25th, the president, in all his opposition to corruption, only brought up two items. One of them had to do with CrowdStrike and this conspiracy theory that the Ukrainians actually hacked the DNC. And the other one had to do with Joe and Hunter Biden, who he named in particular. And that's why a lot of the people who have testified, as we learned this week, and these are not anti-Trumpers, these are people who either work for President Trump right now or have worked for President Trump, they have testified that they came to see that when people talked about corruption, they meant Biden, that's what it actually meant. A lot of the people, whether it's Gordon Sondland or Fiona Hill or Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, one after the other, understood your point of view from like, oh, the president opposes corruption in Ukraine, and who wouldn't oppose corruption, but that in actuality, what they came to see was actually, and I think Fiona Hill used the term code, this was actually code for investigate the Bidens.
Well, again, that's their impression. I've never heard the president say, I want to dig up dirt on a potential 2020 opponent. What I've always heard the president consistently concerned about is what happened in 2016. Why did this, how did this false narrative of Russian collusion with my campaign occur? Why was I strapped with a special counsel?
Right, and there are two investigations about that, right?
There are two investigations of what happened there. It's a very human desire. Jake, you are interrupting me, but go ahead and interrupt me again.
Well, I just want to say, in terms of the investigations into the origins, in May, the Attorney General appointed a former U.S. Attorney, John Durham, who's very respected, to investigate the origins of the Russia investigation. There's also the Inspector General for the Justice Department investigating whether or not the FBI conducted any FISA abuse or any other abuses. There are investigations into that already by the United States law enforcement community.
And by the way, I continue with my oversight with Senator Chuck Grassley, and some pretty interesting things have occurred. The Politico article back in 2017 named Alexandra Chalupa as an American Ukrainian that was hired by the DNC. Now, through Freedom of Information Act requests, we found out that she visited the White House 27 times during the campaign. In our oversight letter, we point out that she had a meeting with 68 Ukrainian journalists. A month later, the Black Ledger digging up dirt on dropping the dime on Paul Manafort occurred. And Nellie Orr also talks about working with a
Paul Manafort's
Ukrainian
in prison
politician that is completely admitted trying to dig up dirt on President Trump as well. So there's a lot of smoke out there. There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And from my perspective, it's a completely legitimate concern on the part of President Trump to find out what happened. I mean, why have I been tormented? Where's this effort to sabotage my presidency since the day after the election? I'd be asking the same questions. And by the way, I am asking the same questions.
So that's not what President Trump is pushing for, though, when he talks about this DNC CrowdStrike server conspiracy theory. Listen to President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor. President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor, Tom Bossert, when it came out that President Trump was pushing for an investigation into this conspiracy theory, this is what Bossert had to say.
It's not only a conspiracy theory, it is completely debunked. Let me just again repeat that it has no validity. The United States government reached its conclusion on attributing to Russia the DNC hack in 2016.
So that's not me. That's President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor. But I want to ask you a question about
that. No, listen. That is the server, and that is correct. But I just pointed out Alexandra Chalupa worked for the DNC. That is a question that remains open.
Yeah.
And so that's a legitimate concern. One thing your CNN article asked was, why was this funding withheld? I would ask a different question. Why weren't the Ukrainians concerned about that well before I met with President Zelensky on September 5th? I was with President Poroshenko on December 18th. There's no problem about this. At the inauguration, this issue wasn't raised. I meet with Ukrainian representatives all the time. Nobody ever raised the issue of the military funding being withheld. So from my standpoint, this is the way I said it to President Zelensky. This is a timing issue. This is the end of the year.
Let me ask you about that timing issue.
I know Mick Mulvaney and Russ Vought. They're fiscal conservatives. Why are we spending this with 3 weeks left in the fiscal year? That's another plausible explanation.
But the NSC officials testified that this wasn't about being a fiscal conservative from Mulvaney.
Another plausible explanation that Ron Johnson of Wisconsin his arguments are so specious, he is almost sounding like he's making debating points on an issue that he doesn't really believe in. I don't know what that's all about, but I thought Jake Tapper did a pretty good job in the cross-examination there. And the moment of the week and all the clips was Jake Tapper in that last clip saying, well, Paul Manafort's in prison. Because that, if you are paying attention to this whole conspiracy theory about the Ukraine, if you believe in it, you also have to believe that Paul Manafort was framed, even though he's in prison, convicted by a jury and by guilty pleas. It's just ridiculous. And I think it's going to become more and more evident that it's ridiculous when the public hearings occur this week. And that's why, even though this week I'm wearing my white on black impeach Trump t-shirt, by next week I will have my custom made red on white impeach Trump t-shirts that you can order either by becoming a patron on Patreon at the $15 level at a link in the video description, giving me a $15 contribution through PayPal at a link in the video description, and tell me your shipping address and whether you want extra large, large, or medium. Or, of course, you can join, become a YouTube channel member. Just click on that join button right under the video. And that's a new feature just starting this week. Those are all the ways that you can support the channel financially, or you can just give me a thumbs up, give me a supportive comment. And before I finish, I do want to show my appreciation. This is a video that I've recorded with no live viewers, and then I'm going to upload it and sort of lurk in the comments as it's a premiere video that live viewers can view. And I appreciate all the people who waited for my live stream that didn't occur because my Wirecast software for some reason wouldn't connect to my YouTube channel, even though I'm using all the same settings I've been using for the last 341 weeks. For some reason it didn't work this week, but people were waiting for the live stream, and even I got a few super chat contributions while people were waiting. Where did it go? Here it is. So thanks to those super chat contributors to the live stream that never happened, and I don't know if any of the live viewers for this premiere video I'm uploading gave super chat contributions, but that's the majority at this point of the YouTube revenue I get. And there are links down in the video description at the $5 level on Patreon. You get this #LiberalViewer weatherproof vinyl sticker. It's more expensive on YouTube memberships. And at the $10 level on Patreon, more expensive on YouTube, you get the ACLU Constitution. And then at the $15 level, even more expensive on YouTube, you get the Impeach Trump t-shirt. And anyway, before I finish, I should give you the bonus Dash and Sandy clip I promised you. This took place just to my left over here. Sandy is snoring over there right now as my only live audience, but Dash was coming in and out. This is Dash and Sandy as my only live audience for this recorded show because of all the YouTube problems. Here it is, the Dash and Sandy clip over here. Sandy. And that's pretty much what Sandy is doing now, just dead to the world, sleeping for some unknown reason. No matter what I say or do, no matter what Dash says or does, just dead to the world, kind of like the Republicans on the evidence of Trump's bribery and impeachable offenses. And anyway, I will be back next week, hopefully wearing my red on white impeach Trump t-shirt. And until then, or until I can do some sort of live stream coverage of the public hearings on impeachment, I guess I'll be seeing you next week, hopefully with a real live stream instead of this recorded show uploaded as a premiere video. And until I can do that or upload some kind of other video, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.